Hello, it's Talk Gnosis. It's a show about Gnosticism, esotericism, religion, and whatever I'm interested in this week and how I can somehow tie it into Gnosticism. We've got a strong tie this week. We're talking about the heresy of Jacob Frank, from Jewish messianism to esoteric myth, with Jay Michaelson. Hello, Jay Michaelson.
Pleasure to be here. This is
You
fun.
know, oh, great. Yeah, we were having a great discussion beforehand, and, I had to cut it off because we don't want we got to save some sizzle for the actual show. And people criticize me because I never do bios. I want to get straight into it, but there's a good chance a lot of our listeners or watchers are going to know who you are from your journalism, from your work on mindfulness. And if you don't know who he is, then go to jmichelson.net. Also, get this book, because chances are if you're listening and watching to the show, you're going to love it as much as I did.
Can I really hawk it? Right? There we go. I'm showing it up for those who are watching on video. There's the cover.
Yeah, The Heresy of Jacob Frank, from Jewish Messianic, I can't even say the word, Messianism to esoteric myth. We'll also link it in the show notes. So, as I always like to do, we'll dive right in, and as I always like to do, ask an enormous question at the top of the show that I hope that you can answer in a couple of minutes. But can you give us the elevator speech of who Jacob Frank was?
Sure. So we'll back up 100 years before Jacob Frank to kind of set a little context. In the middle of the 17th century, the largest messianic movement in Judaism arose in the 1660s around a figure called Sabbataï Tsevi. It's estimated that between a quarter and 1/3 of European Jews may have actually believed that Sabbataï Tsevi was the Messiah in 1666. And while they weren't all necessarily the deepest true believers, that still was really rocked the Jewish establishment. It undermined rabbinic authority, and it transformed Judaism. As the movement grew, the Ottoman Sultan took notice of Sabbataï Tsevi and gave him the choice to convert or die. And Sabbataï Tsevi chose to convert to Islam, thus ending his mass movement as a Jewish Messiah. But the movement did not totally disappear. And for the next 100 years in particular, there were kind of two main ways in which it continued. Some of his followers actually also converted to Islam and became kind of outwardly Muslim, but secretly Messianic Jewish. These were known as the Durnma, the turncoats. So it's not necessarily a term of a complimentary term. And this movement actually lasted through the 20th century, which I find completely fascinating, that there was this kind of open secret that this group of Muslims were actually sort of not Muslim at the same time. In the Jewish community, which is where we'll focus at the beginning of the Jacob Frank story, there were a number of believers in Sabbataï Tsevi who kind of went underground after the apostasy, but continued their messianic belief. And really, until Jacob Frank 100 years later, this community, this kind of subterranean belief in the Messiah, was semi-tolerated, occasionally persecuted, but mostly just kind of ran as an undercurrent in European Jewry, mostly in Ashkenazic Europe and in kind of Northern Europe, and we'll focus in on Poland in particular. Until Jacob Frank, who entered the scene in the 1750s. In the beginning, he went to Salonika, which was the kind of headquarters of the Sabbatian movement, then returned to Poland and became one of many kind of charismatic leaders at the time. But in 1757, his sect was either discovered or alleged to have been engaged in a sexual ritual that may or may not have actually happened, but it almost doesn't matter because it became a gigantic scandal. And the sect was reported by the rabbis to the Catholic Church as a heretical movement. This violated Jewish law. It violated precedent for hundreds of years, but nonetheless, the sense among the rabbinic establishment was this was a bridge too far, and the semi-toleration of these heretics had to come to an end. And so it did. There were numerous twists and turns over those couple of years. Frank fled back to the Ottoman Empire. His sect then collaborated with the church, colluded in anti-Semitic campaigns, very dark period. But then kind of the fortunes flipped a little bit. And in fact, there was a new church leader in charge of this whole investigation. The Frankist sect and Frank himself were given the choice once again to convert or die. And in 1759, the largest mass apostasy in Jewish history took place. It's unknown exactly, but probably a couple of thousand people converted en masse to Catholicism. This was obviously, again, a remarkably traumatic event that was infamous, and the whole sect was infamous. There again, the kind of mass movement or the mass interest in Jacob Frank kind of ends, but the movement also does not die. Frank's conversion is seen to be insincere, accurately, and he's actually thrown in prison for 12 years until in 1772, when an invading Russian army kind of liberates where he was held. He then has a whole other career, which is the focus of my book and the kind of the oral teachings of his that were recorded mostly in the year 1784. These teachings were often regarded as kind of garbage by scholars. Like, he had nothing really to say. This guy was a con man, kind of a 18th century cult leader, to use an anachronism. But I try to show in my book that actually, while he was certainly a devious and manipulative and often violent individual, no paragon of virtue, he also developed this remarkable theology, bringing together a kind of almost liberal or rationalistic critique of religious law. Religious law doesn't work. You shouldn't listen to it. It's garbage. It's holding you back from flourishing, and so forth, with a whole esoteric myth, a kind of Gnostic esotericism that the whole world is the enemy of the true God, as Frank says at one point. And the goal is to, by gaining esoteric gnosis, eventually learn to transcend death and live forever. This is pretty wild stuff for a ex-Jew in the 1780s, 1790s to be talking about. And yet it was recorded in these teachings. Frank did not live forever. His movement ended when he died in the 1790s. His daughter carried it on for another 20 years, but it quickly withered. And yet even there, I say and talk about in the book, Frank and his movement ended, but he prefigured trends that would later become quite dominant, not just in Judaism, but in Western religion, such as that critique of religious authority, religious law, and some of his other innovations. That is my 5-minute introduction to Frank. Not my first time doing it, but I hope that sort of set the stage.
Yeah, I was about to say you must spend a lot of time in elevators talking to people about Jacob Frank. So,
well, it's funny, there's he's not well known. I mean, history is written by the victors, and he lost. But it's funny that also, at the same time in the same place where Frank was doing his work, the Jewish movement known as Hasidism also arose, and it was just a parallel movement, also spiritual, also ecstatic, also charismatic, centered around charismatic leaders. But Hasidism prevailed, and Frankism did not.
yeah. No, I also, reading your book where you do talk about some of his teachings and you paraphrase and quote from the book, The Sayings of the Lord, which I do have a copy of, but I haven't been able to read it yet due to scheduling stuff. I had this sort of secondhand bad opinion of Jacob Frank, right? And I was like, oh wow, this is actually really cool, or this is kind of insightful, or this is a cool little parable, or also, and then fortunately, a couple pages later, oh okay, that's completely insane, that's nuts, that's crude. But even some of the nuttier stuff, the cruder stuff is breathtaking. It's interesting. It's fascinating. His giant phallus that's big enough for children to climb on, right? Is
that line always
grabs the attention.
This is not the first time that line gets singled out in a podcast. Yeah. No, it's, I mean, it's on the one hand, he has one story, where he goes into a synagogue and like takes the Torah out of the ark and sits on it bare-assed, and everybody has to leave because the Torah is being disrespected. I don't think this story ever happened, but just that he tells it is, so this is a crude story, obviously, about disrespecting religion, but also kind of remarkable that this is a story that somebody told to their followers and the followers wrote down as part of a kind of a hagiography. I can't think of another, sage telling his story about how wonderful I am, which involves, sitting bare-assed on a Torah scroll. And so even that, which is one of the most vulgar, not the most, but one of the most vulgar stories in the text, it's remarkable that somebody felt this was how he wanted to present himself. This was the figure of rebellion that he wanted to put out to the world.
Yeah. And can you tell us more about the text and how it portrays Frank as obviously kind of a literary figure, as a literary trickster figure, which is not always accurate to who he was, but of course in some ways, was.
Right. Yeah. So there's now a fantastic 900-page novel about Jacob Frank, right? The Books of Jacob by Olga Tokarczuk, which I mostly love. One thing that I question, I mean, she is very familiar with the Frankist sources. She worked with Pavel Macheko, who's a leading Frankist scholar, and others, I believe. And, she takes those stories as autobiography. And so in her novel, some of the tales from the words of the Lord appear as, she's now, of course, it's a novel. It's a magic realist novel. There's ghosts and spirits. And so it's not like this is bad history. She's writing a novel. But it does give the sense that those, what I call two Jacob Franks, one the historical figure and the other this literary construction, are the same. And I don't think that's true. I think these are tales that are often self-contradictory, that, are wildly magical. Numerous tales about Frank healing the sick and performing miracles and performing feats of superhuman strength. So to me, I want to look at this as a scholar. I want to look at this as a literary creation. And he's creating this figure, kind of like the figure of the holy fool, the person who I'm clearly, don't listen to me. I'm just clearly God's chosen person, because it's not by my own merits that I'm in this role, right? So sort of taking authority and disclaiming it at the same time. He depicts himself as, we were talking earlier before we started, like about teaching crazy wisdom, these kind of radical, crazy, weird acts. He calls them strange acts, which was taken from Sabbataï Tsevi, who also performed strange acts. My favorite of Sabbataï Tsevi's was at one point parading a fish, a carp actually, around in a baby stroller, and it was this whole Kabbalistic symbolism. But that would look pretty crazy, right? And so Frank depicts himself in that lineage, but perhaps even crazier, and definitely more bolder and violent and disrespecting authority in a way that Sabbataï Tsevi did not present himself in that way.
Yeah. Okay, I had more questions about his bio, but you kind of brought us through that, which I'm sure more stuff about his biography will come up when we're talking about some of his teachings and, and where they connect and stuff. But maybe we can just jump into some of his doctrines. So, many have understood his teachings, and maybe not looking at firsthand sources, or if they know a little bit about Frank, as sort of Kabbalistic and Sabbatian. But you write that Western esotericism and Gnosticism, two things that we talk a lot about on this show, might be like a better interpretive lens, or at least better parallels. There's not always direct influence, so you do talk about how there could be direct influence in the case of Western esotericism. But can we go through some of his worldview and maybe highlight some of these parallels? So
sure, yeah. That's why I'm happy. It was fun to come on this show, because I think I've talked about the book a fair amount, and generally it's Frank's critique that gets talked about more, because it's more relatable to more folks, right? So critiquing religious law, why God actually wants you to defy religious law as part of your own, fulfilling your own potential, and I think it's also very fascinating. But the stuff you just mentioned gets talked about less, and it surprised me, because in scholarship it's barely mentioned.
Yes.
Frank is seen now, and it's certainly true that Frank comes out of a Sabbatian context. He was quickly, what was in the words of the Lord was really just intended for his closest disciples, and his larger community saw him as a successor to Sabbataï Tsevi, maybe a reincarnation of Sabbataï Tsevi, and he was folded into that Sabbatian framework as soon as he died, probably while he was still alive. They understood him differently from how he was presenting himself to his closest disciples. So a little bit like we were talking again before, a little bit like there's the outer Scientology and the inner Scientology, and there's the doctrine for the inner circle. So this material that we're about to look at was for the inner circle, and it is again, really shocking. And Gershom Scholem, the leading scholar of Kabbalah, did write about this part, that it's, when you look at the Gnosticism of his teachings, again, that the world was not created by the good God, that there are these three deities who kind of maintain the world. Similar, he doesn't use the term demiurge, but that there are these figures who don't have our best interests at heart, and they're not even really deities in the way that we might. He says at one point that these three mimunim, these three guardians of the world, actually take human form and they wield temporal power, but they are also in charge of kind of all of the terrible things that happen in the world. At the foundation of his worldview is kind of what he sees as an impossibility, that a good God would create this world that's filled with disease and death and strife. And it's helpful to just remember, this was like the Frankist sect and Tokarczuk does this really beautifully in her novel. These are the persecuted part of the persecuted people, right?
Yeah.
So it's not easy to be a Jew in, Eastern Europe, Central Europe in the 18th century. And these were the Jews that the other Jews persecuted, right? These were the sect within the people that were being persecuted. And one theory actually about Frankism put forth by a scholar named Hillel Levine was that was kind of a cargo cult, like a way to get out of it, right? This legitimized conversion to Christianity. I'm not really sure that's true, but it's just interesting from a sort of social point of view to consider that. So for Frank, this world is incompatible with the God that he relates to, that he does seem to have some communication with. He sees himself, he does kind of have these prophetic utterances, and so therefore it must be something else. It must be not the true. And so he has this whole conception of this world, and I think maybe here it's more on the esoteric side. I don't know if there's a clear line between esotericism and Gnosticism, but more on the esoteric side, there is a much larger world, which he kind of calls the world behind the screen, or the world behind the curtain, depending on how you translate it, where people do live forever. And there's even a parallel sect to Frank's own sect, headed by a figure he calls the Big Brother, who's kind of his parallel in the other world. And the two sects, Frank's and this otherworldly one, want to meet one another. And they want to connect. It's not quite clear. Frank says many times, the Big Brother wants something from me, just like we want something from him. It's not really clear what that is, but certainly from the Big Brother, Frank's sect would learn the secrets of immortality. In the 1780s, Frank was in direct contact with Western esoteric groups. That's not speculative. Frankists actually started their own Masonic lodge, the Society of the Asiatic Brethren, which was itself kind of marginalized by mainstream Freemasonry, partly because it was admitting Jews or ex-Jews or whatever the Frankists were seen to be. But they were in close contact with these communities. And Frank was doing alchemical experiments in his home, in this rented kind of or borrowed castle that he was living in for the last 15 years or so of his life. So he's very much in that context. And yet he does bring in occasionally Kabbalistic concepts where that kind of helps him, as we also saw with a lot of other Jewish or ex-Jewish esotericists of the time. Wolf Eibeshitz is another one of these, who kind of was the son of a suspected Sabbatian, who we now know was a real Sabbatian. Wolf Eibeshitz did convert, and there were these figures who kind of had this mystique of Kabbalah, or quote, I'll scare quote the term Oriental, but Oriental mystique, like this exotic appearance. Frank would wear kind of Turkish garb most of the time. And that what's fascinating to me is that this theology, if we want to call it that, or cosmology, kind of Frank synthesized this theology out of these multiple different places into something that I found startling when I first came across it. And again, although it's been written about a little bit, it's certainly not what people associate with Jacob Frank.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I realize that not everybody has my same obsessions, and just tracing influences is something that I like. And we were talking about before the show, sometimes there's direct influence, sometimes there's just parallel thinking, and sometimes there's just people are drinking from the same well, so they're going to reach similar conclusions. But you mentioned the Asiatic Brethren, and Asiatic in the use of the term in this case means something more like Oriental, right? Eastern. It's meant to evoke exoticism, but
yeah.
it was,
and it's more Semitic, let's say, like it's Middle Eastern. It's not a pretension to, like, let's say East Asia or South Asia. It's like Asiatic in the sense of Turkey and the land of Israel, and in the Middle East.
Precisely. That's what they mean by the term. And as you mentioned, it was sidelined. It was only around for a little while, but it was incredibly influential on Western esotericism. You don't get later movements like the Golden Dawn without this group first. And their materials and some of their teachings are used later, and they also kind of just distribute even among non-members some of these ideas. So that is sort of a point of contamination. Maybe that's not the right term for a lot of these ideas, and I find that fascinating. But can you talk about something that is a big theme of your book, and something that is quite startling and confusing in Jacob Frank's thought, is that it's this materialistic spirituality. Can you tell us more about this materialistic world that's full of magic and powers at the same time?
Sure. So, this also for me, early on in my research, I've been doing this a long time, was a little bit puzzling, actually, until I became more familiar with the Western esoteric material, which has a very similar worldview. So it looks like, in a certain way, like he's got a foot on each side of a divide. So on the one hand, he's got a kind of anti-spiritual materialism. So he says at one point, I don't look to heaven, but at what God does here on earth. And again, one of the stories that I cite in the book a few times, he goes to a synagogue called the Synagogue of the Prophet Elijah. And, that's just a name. There's some story that Elijah the prophet once visited, but he demands to see Elijah the prophet. And the person in the synagogue is, it doesn't work that way. And he beats up the guy running the synagogue because he says, how can you call yourself the congregation of Prophet Elijah? There's no Prophet Elijah here. That's ridiculous, right? So there's this literalism, hyperliteralism, materialism, like show me the money. Like if I can't see it, it's not real. Okay. And then on the other side of this divide, and I'm going to say that there's not actually a divide, but it looks like a divide, is this radically mythic conception of the world. So Frank's stories in particular, which are really almost without parallel. I think it's one of the, I could have written a whole other book just on the literary quality of these stories, which are endlessly surprising and twisted and in ways that you really don't expect. Those stories are filled with magical beings, with wizards, with witches, with sorcerers, with magical herbs, with magical rocks, with, some of these are actually taken from Jewish folklore. He has a whole idea that there are these people living in caves who are going to help the Frankist sect, and there's a whole myth around them. And then, of course, the whole myth I just talked about with the Big Brother and the world behind the screen. So you're kind of like, well, what's going on? Like, on the one hand, you're saying, show me, if I can't see it, it's not true. On the other hand, you're telling me about all of this like magical, weird creatures and things like that. But we do see that same juxtaposition in Western esotericism. And I think for me, so the world, there is what we might think of as magic, but it's real, it's material. It's not kind of some vague spiritual promise of another world, but there actually are all of these forces. And what struck me, actually, there was one point in a much earlier period, in the medieval period, there was a rabbinic sage who said that the temple was located where it was in Jerusalem, not because God chose it or designated it, but because it was at a particular, an astrologically propitious place. Which is similar to like the idea of like the ley lines, like it was at a power place basically, and that's why so if you think about that for a moment, on the one hand, we might see that, I know you and I, but folks today might see that as, well, that's superstition or that's magic, but in a certain way, it's actually science, right? It's saying, no, this wasn't chosen because some deity in their infinite wisdom chose this spot. There's actually something about this place. And Frank says the same thing about Częstochowa, which is the kind of national shrine of Poland where Frank was imprisoned. And I visited Częstochowa. It's still the national shrine of Poland. There's a painting of the Virgin Mary that is venerated by pilgrims from all over. And it's not venerated as the Virgin Mary. It's venerated as the physical object, the painting itself. It's painted on wood, and it's now been gilded in gold and so forth. And so even that, I think, I don't know if that was the direct influence on Frank, but just that, it's also venerating a physical object with physical magical power, whether it's to heal or to defend Poland. And this portrait is imbued with this energy, this power, right? And it's not like a kind of immaterial spiritual thing. It's some quote unquote real power. And as I saw that more in Western esotericism, it was like the decoder ring for some of what Frank says. So it's not that the world is just as it appears, with flowers and trees. It's the world as it really is, with flowers and trees and magical rocks and wizards and forces and other beings and demons and so forth. But all of those are, in a certain sense, science, in that they are things, they are creatures, they are beings. And he understands scriptural text in the same way that a Western esotericist might read the Bible, finding like, so here's how Solomon did, here's the key of Solomon, here's how Solomon did all this magic, here's Asmodeus, here's Benayahu, here are these figures who Solomon's not marginal, but who are often marginal in the biblical text, who become central with a magical reading of biblical text, and they're central in Frank as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you even mentioned in your book, right? Like, the problem of astrology in some people's eyes is not that it was superstition, but that it was too scientific. It takes agency away from God. And I think even in high school, people were taught that alchemy, led to chemistry. It is in a weird way, and this is during the Enlightenment. This esoteric worldview is strangely materialistic and scientific, like what you're saying, and he's imbibing in that. That's his worldview. And it also,
And
he
I
also
think,
talks
I
about.
just wanted to build on that for 1 second. That
Yeah.
I think astrology is a really helpful parallel here. So I think when people in the 21st century see astrology, skeptics certainly see it as, kind of superstition, right? The opposite of science. But if we really think, if we imagined that astrology were true, right? It really is science, right? It's the things that are happening to you are due to material, physical things happening in the world, in the universe, because of the stars. So we're recording this right now. Mercury's in retrograde. So like the bad thing that happens we may see the superstitious side of that. Oh, it's about Mercury. That's silly. Da 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 da. But we should also see the scientific side. Like it's offering us a scientific, we may not agree with the science or believe the science, but a scientific type of explanation for things that happen in the world. And that, again, when I sort of got that both in esotericism and in Frank, some of the stuff that seems to make no sense whatsoever starts to make sense. Sorry to interrupt, but I just thought
Oh, no,
I thought
please.
the astrology analogy is really apt because of how we see it, whereas how someone who believes in that worldview might see it, especially in the past, a couple hundred years ago.
Yeah. I forgot to mention before the show, but this is, sometimes guests, they don't like to interrupt because they're nice, like you, and they don't like to go on rants, but this is the interrupt and rant show because,
All right.
people don't need me, right?
No,
I'm
I
just
want to
here.
go back to what you said about the Asiatic Brethren having an influence, because that's outside my specialty. Like, I don't know about that. And that's fascinating to me, that one of the weirdest things, by the way, to do a tangent about this research, was that some of the people who get Frankism right are anti-Semites, like are
Mm,
crazy anti-Semites. They're conspiracy theories. So David Icke is the main one of these, right?
mm.
The horrible sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy monger from England who thinks that, right, there are these aliens who are kind of reptilian aliens and the Jews aren't really Jews. But the amazing thing is that he actually seems to get a lot about Frankism correct. And there is, right, so one of the great anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, right, the Jewish Masonic plot to start the French Revolution. That's not true, of course. Obviously, I'm not in any way endorsing any anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I'm a rabbi, but there is a tiny, tiny thread of truth to it through the Frankist sect, right? So Frank's leading disciple, who was said to maybe have been groomed to be his successor, Moses de Bruschka, did actually play a bit part in the French Revolution and used the Masonic connections to smuggle arms from the Habsburg Empire to the French revolutionaries, because the Habsburgs wanted to take down France, right? So, and he was executed under the name of Junius Frey, was executed during the Reign of Terror. So there actually is a tiny, now, again, just reiterating, this is not the conspiracy theory, but it's remarkable that there's some of these kinds of weird little undercurrents, which do have a grain of truth to them. I kept reading, I was like, I don't know where David Icke got his knowledge of Frankism from, and obviously the guy is responsible for horrible violence and terrible ideas in the world, and yet strangely got this partly right,
Yeah. Yeah.
which was weird.
Well, Google Gnostics and Gnosticism, and
Oh dear,
I'm
yeah,
not
you get
saying,
right, you get some of the good and some of the not so good.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, really for the Asiatic Brethren, what's interesting when you talk about some of the crossovers between Sabbatianism and Frankism, right? But some of the Frankists are also Sabbatians, and as you said, Frank doesn't, he almost parodies Kabbalah, right? You have a chapter in that in your book. But it seems that some of the Frankists picked up the Sabbatian Kabbalah and they bring that into the Asiatic Brethren, and then that basically becomes the Kabbalah of later groups, of a group like the Golden Dawn. And the Golden Dawn's the Kabbalah is deeply Sabbatian.
Hmm.
And if you don't get the Golden Dawn, you don't get tarot, right? You don't get modern tarot, and you don't get all the quote unquote Kabbalistic, well, I'll spell it with a Q there. People can't hear the Q when I'm speaking. Symbolism that's in tarot, right? And then you don't get Aleister Crowley, and then you probably don't even get the Theosophical Society, even though they're at the same time as the Golden Dawn. But they are drawing on some of this older material, right? And what they're calling Kabbalah. So then you don't get the New Age movement. Then you don't get yada yada yada. So it is this match that really does spark a huge fire, even if it wasn't that big at the time. And when you look at sort of what we'll charmingly call esoteric histories, mythological histories. Another name that the Asiatic Brethren used was the Knights of St. John. And there's these legends that my community, and I say that they're legends, even though they kind of in some ways reflect the historical flow of ideas in a mythologized way. They sort of play an important role with an idea of underground Johannite Gnostics, and which I don't believe to be historically true, but I do think that it is true in a sense that is almost literal about how these ideas are sort of sloshing around Europe. But moving on, a physical worldly accumulation of power and goods. And you mentioned Cagliostro in the book. There's actually a lot of parallels with Cagliostro and Jacob Frank. And he was known for selling people spells for winning the lottery, selling the secret to making gold. So can you tell us a bit about how the physical worldly accumulation of power and goods plays into the thought of Jacob Frank, as well as the Western esotericism?
Sure. Yeah, it seems so. Two prefatory things. First, Frank seemed to have mostly a different financial model. He was making his money on contributions from his followers, primarily in Warsaw and in Prague, who continued to kind of support him, and through some of his political connections and, sort of an underworld figure. So, but one person, when you mentioned that about Cagliostro, I thought about the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, or legendary founder of Hasidism, who did do that, right? I mean, this was common for Jewish sages who were in the magical Kabbalah, business, so to speak, selling amulets for protection or for healing or for luck. And so this was a widespread phenomenon, and one that was kind of in a certain way marginalized by scholarship. It was seen as, well, that's not the real stuff. The real stuff are these theosophical speculations on the nature of the Godhead. But the Kabbalists and the mystics didn't necessarily see that distinction. And Kabbalah Masit, practical Kabbalah, was probably the most widely practiced and widely available. For Frank, one thing that I think is a helpful lens or a way to understand his embrace of the worldly is his retelling of the myth of Jacob and Esau. So in standard kind of rabbinic Judaism, Esau, who founds Edom, is basically a stand-in for Christianity. And so Esau is the stronger brother, the one who has all the power, right? Which is certainly how Christianity was relative to Judaism, arguably still today, but certainly, in this period. And kind of the mean big brother, the bully in a way. But obviously Jacob is really the chosen one, right? And Jacob in the text, and I talk about this in some of my LGBTQ themed writing in the biblical text, he's kind of, scare quoting here, feminized in a certain way. He's given these attributes of not having this power, right? Physically, right? He has like the high voice and the smooth skin, but he also hangs out in the tents. That's where the women hang out. And it's this whole kind of conception of the true Jewish. It's a whole, you good?
I got hit by Mercury retrograde there.
Yeah, that was definitely the stars.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Could you? I'll edit around this. Could you start at the very beginning of the Jacob and Esau?
Very beginning of Jacob and Esau. Okay.
Up. Yeah, sorry.
Can I do the LGBT part, and I'll just do that because then I don't do the Christianity, or you want the Christianity part also?
If you could do the whole.
All right, I'll do the whole.
Okay, thanks so much.
So sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, one helpful way to kind of understand how the accumulation of power and material wealth, which Frank talks about in detail, like in the future, my coaches will be like this and my food will be like that. One way to understand this is his rereading of the biblical myth of Jacob and Esau. So in standard Jewish conception, Jacob, the kind of the younger brother, this is a stand-in for Judaism, and Esau is Edom and stand-in for Christianity and for Rome before that. And so Esau is all material power. Jacob is spiritual power. Esau is very masculine, whereas in the text, Jacob is kind of, I'll scare quote the word feminine, in that he doesn't have the power. He doesn't have the physical strength. He has a high voice and he stays by the tent and smooth skin. I mean, he's seen as kind of the feminine younger brother who's bullied by the mean older brother. And you can kind of map that. You can see why this was an appealing myth for Jews living under the thumb of Christianity in Europe. Frank actually kind of really radically rereads this whole thing and says that this was actually Jacob's fault for missing that he could have actually really taken on Esau. What we need is to combine Jacob and Esau. And Jacob Frank, will be the tikkun, which is like the repair, the correction for the biblical Jacob. And Jacob should have seized all of this power. And Frank genders it as well. Frank has a very, I would say in anachronistic terms, toxic masculine self-conception, right? His masculinity is not, it's toxic masculinity, right? Violent and aggressive and strong and sexualized and misogynistic. And that for him is part of this new Jewish Christian combination. So for him, all of this accumulation of wealth, and we see similar themes, by the way, in the contemporary Kabbalah Center, where material, it's kind of like the prosperity gospel, like your bearing of material wealth is a sign of your spiritual advancement. They don't see these two things as opposed. Never mind that easier to get through a camel, get through the eye of the needle than a rich man to enter heaven. No, it's the opposite. It's this material success. For Frank, this is really where chosenness and success is demonstrated, the material world. And so he has this, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling or self-legitimizing ideology, right? It legitimizes his own career and his own exploitation, you could say, of his followers and his own advancement. But it also, and at the same time, right, it's not one or the other, also has this conception of a kind of seizing of power. In some texts, Frank actually has a triumphalist account, like the Christianity will be overthrown and so forth. In others, and earlier in his career, it would be coexisting with Christian Europe, but with some power and some autonomy. And, again, this was the literature of the persecuted of the persecuted. These were marginalized, mostly impoverished Jews, ex-Jews, living in an incredibly it's hard to even say discriminatory. I mean, a horribly discriminatory society and social context. And the idea that there could be a Jewish return to history, return to power, this is what would animate, Zionism 120 years later, that we actually have to, we need to get away from this myth of Jacob and Esau and actually seize, gain power for ourselves. That had its own problematic consequences, but we see that in Frank as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you could elaborate a bit on this, you mentioned it before, which is a striking parallel with Gnosticism. But this world is being ruled by three malevolent gods, and I think maybe a point for a parallel with Gnosticism is are these gods also ignorant? Do they even know about the other world, the world behind the screen?
That's interesting. I don't think I know the answer to that. I can't think of a text where Frank addresses that.
Sorry to clarify, we don't have a systematic of theology, by the
way.
Right? We don't have Frank writing down.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, he talks about that quest in hundreds of statements. Like, that's not it. So it's interesting to think, like, is that, I mean, it definitely is an escape from their rule, from their domain, and it's not up to them, right? So they have all of these, they're fighting it. So I guess that means that, I mean, they don't want the sect to succeed. Whether that they know what it is that the sect is striving for, that's actually a fascinating question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. And one of the proximate sources, I know we were talking before, you'd had David Halpern on the show. He's done the best translation and work on Cardozo, who was a follower of Sabbataï Tsevi, who created his own theology. Cardozo was also a converso, meaning he had been Christian before he was Jewish. And his theology also is somewhat Gnostic. And, implicit in Sabbatianism is a sort of foundational idea that the true world isn't what we're seeing in front of us, right? So for Sabbatianism, the Messiah has come, where actually it's possible to have messianic consciousness in this world and through transgression of the law. And that's kind of the real reality. And it's this sort of faith that the messianic age is here, despite all evidence to the contrary. Frank does away with that notion of, like, faith in the unseen. As you can imagine, he clearly has no real interest in that, but he still does. He maintains this kind of basic grammar, I would say, that the world as we find it is not the ultimate, right? And that there is this, with the right, where he's very different from the Sabbatians, it's not up to faith in Sabbataï Tsevi to get to the ultimate. It's getting that gnosis, which he calls das, the sort of portmanteau, or this kind of combination of knowledge, which is the Hebrew word da'at, or da'as in the Ashkenazic pronunciation, and dat, the word for religion, probably, and maybe even just the word this, das, in German. But I think mostly we understand, I translate das based on it appearing in 100 or 200 dicta as gnosis. And this is the new religion that we're really after, is the gnosis. And what's the knowledge, the gnosis of? It's this way to the other world. It's knowing the true structure of reality and using that to transcend death.
Yeah. You mentioned a Big Brother, but we didn't really dive into him yet. Can you tell us about a Big Brother?
Yeah, it's a complicated figure, partly because it's not systematic. He's not systematized. So I've read, there are scholarly texts where, like, Frank actually talks about God as the Big Brother. That definitely doesn't seem to be true. The Big Brother is Frank's parallel. There is one text where he talks about this world behind the screen as essentially a world of fire, which is not a material world, but actually sort of, it's not clear what's meant by fire exactly, right? But it's going to blend fire and earth. We're in the earthy world and they're in the fire world, which in a way returns it to me as almost like a spiritual conception. So their energy, or I don't know really, he doesn't use the word energy, but uses the word fire.
Alchemical too, right? You're combining earth and fire into something new. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, no, the Big Brother has his followers, just like Frank has his followers, and this is kind of the mirror image just of the closer disciples. Again, this was the secret gnosis, just for the inner circles. And for me, maybe you could say more about this, because to me the parallels to early Mormonism are really striking.
Absolutely.
There is, again, the sort of, sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's not. Like, are Mormons living forever in the physical temple, like actually in the temple, or on other worlds, or whatever the doctrine is? But there is this kind, and also the similar thing where there's the inside and the outside. So there's the exoteric doctrine and then the esoteric doctrine. And it's always been interesting to me, more for Mormons than for Scientologists. But when the esoteric gets discovered, the different ways of relating to it. So maybe drive it further underground, or try to sanitize it in some way, or to say, yeah, this is our esoteric doctrine. You also believe some crazy things. Here's there are lots of different strategies of this revelation of the esoteric, and it's definitely not. The Frankist text was eventually circulated to some of the wider followers in Warsaw. It does seem that they censored some of it and suppressed some of it. In fact, we haven't talked too much about sexual practice, but we don't really know the extent to which sexual ritual was practiced in the sect. It was definitely practiced to a very limited extent, but it may have been in sort of popular imagination, it was like sex orgies all the time. There's no evidence of that. But on the other hand, maybe the evidence was suppressed, right, by followers 100 years later who were scandalized by it. I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to that question. But, for me, the doctrine of the Big Brother was part of this small esoteric doctrine that I don't know was ever intended to be circulated just to the wider Frankist community, let alone to the rest of us. But I've always been struck by the esotericism to Mormonism. And there's the book The Refiner's Fire is about, there's a lot of really great books on the sort of Gnostic esoteric Latter-day Saints connection. Maybe you want to say more about that, because I could learn from you on that.
Well, I think most of it is in your book, because you do make the parallel at some point, I think, just in passing. But when I was reading the book,
weirdly,
I was like,
Amazon filed my book under Mormonism, by the way.
Oh, no.
So for a brief time, the algorithm, I don't know, it must have just picked up the word or something. It was definitely not, when we filled out the forum, when Oxford Press filled out the forum, I'm sure that wasn't in there. So for a while, I had the 100th best-selling book on Mormonism on Amazon.
but that's just it. I think maybe you mentioned this also in passing in your book. book, it's drinking, even though, Joseph Smith is later, right? He is involved with esoteric Freemasonry, and he's picking up these second, third hand esoteric ideas, Western esotericism, and Gnostic ideas, and he's putting his own spin on them. And it is interesting that he reaches these similar parallels with Frankism, with this very embodied physical mix, right? Now, besides that, I can't say much more on it. But I think what it is this. I do think Western esotericism does spread around. It's not always Gnostic, but there are Gnostic streams within it, Gnostic themes. I think some of these Gnostic streams and themes are very ancient. But here we have sort of a combination of this focus on the here and now, the material world, which you've been discussing, which keeps popping up in Western esotericism, which may or may not be in contrast to Gnostic themes, but both are being carried by the same stream. Does that make sense? So it makes sense that if you're getting it from the same point of contact, that you're going to try to combine them, even if they're strangely at odds, or if not at odds, there's a tension there. But they're two letters arriving in the same envelope. And I think people like Frank and Joseph Smith are opening up the envelope and taping the two letters together. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to steal that.
Okay, please.
Yeah, no, I think that's just a really good, and one of the side points of that is when you see those two letters together, and it gives rise to an inference that there's that envelope, right? So it's like, well, that's strange. We see this combination of two kind of contradictory doctrines. Well, we also see that exact same combination, or if not exact same, a similar combination, in these other currents, going back hundreds of years. So I think, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, that said, even though I think there is that tension there, I think that the idea that the Gnosticism is about hating the body, wanting to get out of this world is not necessarily true, right? And a lot of scholars have been doing work on this, and I think there's been lots of streams of Gnosticism going back to very ancient streams that are strangely very focused on this world. My personal interpretation is that the world is broken, everything is broken. Learn how to live with that, right? There's crack in everything. That's how the light gets through. But there's some work on the Carpocratians that perhaps that they were trying to build Plato's Republic, that they were literally reading the Republic and trying to establish it on Earth. Maybe with this understanding that things are a little bit messed up, but let's try to do our part. So that said, I still think that there is this tension that I'm talking about.
But even that Plato's even implicit in that tension is even in Plato.
Plato,
right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
On the one hand, right, here's how to build the Republic in this world. On the other hand, right, the metaphor of the cave. So everything we're seeing is just the surface level of the and yeah, no, I think that's really evocative, right? I mean, there's no such thing as Gnosticism everywhere, right? There's lots of different streams, and especially when it's in a soup, a Western esoteric soup. Right, so there's some from this stream and some from that stream, and they harmonize or they don't. But it's certainly that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and also Gnosticism, and some scholars say, well, there was never any ancient Gnosticism. It's a creation of heresy hunters, which I don't agree with. But the term is slippery, right? And my newest definition for the term Gnosticism is it's whatever I say it is. And it's something that at least for me is a Gnostic theme. That is kind of in Frank is it's very mysterious, even confusing who God is, because Big Brother may or may not be God, or sometimes is God, but really isn't a true God. Right, and it's not the three gods that rule this earth, right? And you mentioned that sort of the biblical God is a shed. Is that how you say it?
Yeah. So one of the names for the Bible has many names for God. One of them is Shaddai, which actually etymologically is probably connected to breasts. It's actually possibly a bit of the divine feminine kind of filtered into biblical theology, which is very provocative to think about. But for Frank, he says Shaddai is a shed. Shed is the word for demon. So actually one of the times Shaddai speaks many times, the traditional Jewish explanation, Shaddai is just another name for God. So Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Elohim, Shaddai, these all refer to the same deity. But Frank says Shaddai is actually a shed, is actually a demon. So, you could go back and pick like a biblical scholar does, because the biblical scholarly view is that these do represent different traditions that were then stitched together in the Bible. But that's not Frank's view, but he has a similar kind of methodology in a certain way. You could go back, and wherever Shaddai is speaking, for Frank, that's the demon. On the other hand, Frank, I think, is very clear. He does have, and this is not original to him by any means, a certain skepticism about, like, the record of the Bible is not a record of what really happened. Something really happened for Frank, right? There is this magic. So for, like, the Queen of Sheba, for example, is one of his heroes, as for many magic folks in Western esotericism. So the way she's depicted in the Bible for Frank is like a very partial figure of the what he sees as the reality, or what he teaches anyway, is the reality of her power and her existence. And Solomon only kind of gets his power from her in the Frankist version of the myth. And so that ties into his whole, he has a conception of a sort of recurring divine feminine figure called the maiden, who's actually the Messiah, and who's kind of sensuality and power incarnate in a feminine figure. And so for Frank, there's this rereading of the Bible through a very, I would, an esotericist lens, but also a kind of skeptical lens. Like, you're only getting one version of the story here, and actually the real story is much more complicated and has to do with all of the themes we've been discussing.
Yeah. Can you tell us? I'm not going to be able to say this right, but the mysterious sages, the Balai Kaben,
Balai Kaben, yeah.
Balai Kaben.
Yeah.
Tell us about them.
Yeah, this is, again, one of those things that when I first came across it. So there is, and I talk about this in the book, there is kind of a long-standing legend that derives itself even from the Talmudic period and from legendary material from there, that begins actually about whether you can carry a prosthesis on the Sabbath, believe it or not. That's like and so then from that develops a Jewish folkloric legend about these people who have these, you're allowed to carry your prosthetic limb on the Sabbath. That's a Jewish legal point, because normally you're not allowed to carry things on the Sabbath. And then there becomes this whole legend about these people, like that's not just one person with a prosthesis, it's a whole group of people, and they become these kind of magic figures. In Frank, they're almost like kind of a little bit like how Icelandic people see the elves, right? So like, they are real. They are not elves in Iceland. I don't know if you've had Icelandic elf folks on the show, but they are not magical Lucky Charms beings. These are people. They would like to be left alone. Thank you very much. They live in certain places. The Balai Kaben are kind of similar for Frank. That's this quasi-magical beings. It's not just people who have prosthesis, but they can kind of fly, and they have magical power. They have a lot of gold, and they're going to come at one point. They'll come to the aid of the Frankist community when the good stuff happens, whether it's the war or the ascension to power. And here again, it's this combination of using some Jewish materials, totally rereading them into a different mythic form. But yeah, there would be this kind of but he says, the cave is right there in Shostakova. It's not like in some magical other world. So again, a kind of fascinating combination of materialism and myth.
Yeah. Immortality and the construction of a soul as an alchemical process, which has a lot of parallels with Western esoteric thought. But can you, like, for instance, you mentioned Cagliostro, we've mentioned him. You even mentioned his Egyptian Freemasonry. Well, his Egyptian Freemasonic system ends with an alchemical working that basically restores your body, makes you young again, and he sort of hints that this process gives you some kind of immortality, and it starts off as a physical process, right? You are made young again. So are you then young and immortal forever? It's a little bit unclear. Or does this kind of create a soul body for you that will allow you to continue on after death? It's not quite clear from the materials. But can you tell us about the sort of Frank's take on this?
Yeah, also not clear, I think. I don't think he bothered to work it out. And there is a point, I think, where he says we will get new bodies. There's one text in that, he has in one chapter of the book, I tried to kind of, and I may have over schematized it, to try to map out the stages of this transformation. So the first stages have been accomplished, right? So, what really happened in history, the sect converted, and the sect thought before conversion, they were petitioning to get an autonomous region of Poland where they could be separate, basically, from the rabbis and from the Polish authorities as well. That didn't work out. Then the scandal happened, the conversion happened. That didn't work out. Frank was actually thrown in jail. So, the thought might have been, great, we've now converted to Christianity. We're going to be Christians and get rich, right? But instead, since these things didn't work out, Frank later, now we're 25 years later, works out this post hoc rationalization for the conversion. So the real reason this happened was to get us closer to Edom, Christianity, and that was on the way to get us to Das, to Gnosis. And from the Das, there would be a number of transformations that would take place. Ruling over animals is one of them. I'm curious if that actually shows up in any of the other materials. Gaining new clothes, like some sort of magical attire that may have something to do with magical attire from the Bible, or may even just be the Polish national attire that people wore, nobility wore. We'll gain this magical attire. We'll then liberate the maiden, who I mentioned before. She's going to be the gateway to the other world. And from the other world, we will then have these new souls and or new bodies, and live forever. And yet that coexists with the material versions of his predictions of the future, which some of them just look like the world will continue as it is, but we will have this power. So we'll be kind of the uber secret society, where whether that's post-immortality or not is not clear. It's not developed. And I think it's probably just contradictory. They're in different places in the text. So it might just be a different myth that he's telling. For me, the sort of prophecies of the future part are the least interesting things that Frank says and the most conventional. After he dies, his disciples circulate a text allegedly written by Frank, but actually very different from anything he'd ever said in his life, dense with prophetic allusions and references, saying there's about to be an apocalyptic war very soon, like next year, and everybody's going to die, but the Ma'aminim, the believers, the true believers from the Jews will survive. Look, I mean, as a scholar, that's part of the teaching. I'm not going to just pretend it's not there because I don't find it interesting, but it's probably the least innovative. And it's really literally, the end of the world is nigh. Frank will come back, or is still alive, or something like that, similar to most false messiahs who die. And we're going to win. We're going to win in the end. So it's a vague, anytime he's talking about the future, I think in the esoteric side, it's a little more interesting and less conventional, but it's still not particularly well defined.
Yeah. So I think another parallel with Gnosticism that people have been noticing from a figure that you're mentioning is the maiden, and I know that she's a rather complicated figure with Frank. But can you tell us about her and what she has to do with the Shekinah, the Shekinah, what she has to do with sexual antinomianism, what she has to do with this painting of the Virgin that you mentioned, and what she has to do with the Messiah, and what she has to do with Eve Frank, the Jacob Frank's daughter?
So she is the Messiah. Frank is often described as a false Messiah, but he never actually set himself out in those terms. There is a Jewish concept of the Messiah, the son of Joseph, and the Messiah, the son of David. So the Messiah, the son of David, is the real Messiah, but the first one will announce, kind of a John the Baptist figure, actually, will announce the coming of the true Messiah. In a way, Frank has that role, but he never actually makes use of those images, those particular references. So the maiden, it's tricky for scholars because you keep picking among the different. So I mean, I cataloged every single dictum in which she is mentioned and tried to put them together in a way that did justice to the sources. Long story short, she seems to be a kind of perennial figure who incarnates over and over again in humans, or takes a human avatar, you could say. That's not in the text. That's me putting that in, maybe because I just saw the movie. She's Queen Esther. She, who kind of uses, if you think about what Queen Esther does, if for folks not familiar with that story, she pretends to be Persian, right? She marries the king. She uses sexuality to advance her way, right? Her beauty, and then actual sexuality with the king, ultimately for this purpose of saving the Jewish people. So there again, that's she is Queen Esther is a sexual antinomian. That's not how I was taught the Purim story in Sunday school, but she is, right? She's transgressing. You can't do that. You're not allowed to marry a Gentile king and have sex with him, and right? That's not how it's supposed to go. But that's kind of glossed over in the story. What's focused on is her heroism, of course, right? That she stands up and saves the Jews. But for Frank, she's this transgressive hero, and she's a model of using transgression, but sexual transgression in particular, to bring about the redemption. And so it seems certain that Frank thought that the maiden was incarnated in the Black Virgin of Częstochowa. And that would explain why, her role as this kind of savior figure and protector figure, but also in Frank's daughter, Eve. who did become the leader of the sect afterwards, but before, when Frank was still alive, was sort of venerated as potentially the Messiah incarnate. And here again, it's not quite clear. Was the idea that Eve would become kind of the queen? Eve herself, by the way, had a sort of Queen Esther moment where she had an affair with Joseph II of Austria, and there again was very kind of similar in a way. Like Frank played the role of Mordecai, Esther's uncle or protector, whatever he was, and kind of. We do have Eve's voice in the text. There are a number of dicta which are stated by Eve, including recounting of her own dreams. It's always in these things, certainly from a 21st century perspective, what the consent level was, or it's obviously extremely problematic. But this did happen apparently, and the affair was real until it went sour. So this maiden figure is kind of representative of this sexual liberation that would be a hallmark of the Messianic age. That was taken not just from Sabbatian Kabbalah, but even from Zoharic Kabbalah and Lurianic Kabbalah, that in the Messianic age, the rules of the Torah of this world would no longer apply. And there'd be a different Torah that would govern that age. And that is a fundamental antinomian conception. Antinomian just means against the concept of the nomos, or the law. That's within mystical Judaism as well, not just within heretical mystical Judaism. It gets amplified. And the Dernma did engage in some limited choreographed sexual rituals as a way of enacting the Messianic age. And again, now we're talking, 17th as well as 18th century. And that continued apparently through at least the 19th and probably into the 20th century, where there would be, if not some kind of group sexual activity ritualized on a particular day of the year. So again, like, orgies are great, nothing against orgies, but these weren't quite them. It was not a sort of free-for-all. It was a ritual. And again, we certainly see that obviously in Crowley, but also in other forms of later Western esotericism, this notion that the sexual act for Sabbatism, it's a little bit different from how I understand it in later magic. It's not necessarily that act generates power, but it inculcates this messianic consciousness. And for me, and here I get a little bit on my more skeptical side toward the end of the book, I want to kind of take that seriously. I mean, the idea, to me, this is actually the birth of what is now the dominant strain in Jewish spirituality. So the Hasidim took the same notion. They just sublimated the eroticism to erotic prayer with the Shekhinah, with the divine presence. And so there are all these mainstream Hasidic texts, which you should understand men should pray as if they're having sex with the Shekhinah. And that creates spiritual consciousness. That creates this closeness, this expanded mind, this cleaving to the divine. That, in a more tame way, is what's commonplace in spirituality. So you get into a kind of ecstatic experience, and that experience brings you closer to God. But if we look historically in the lineage, this is that lineage of that experience. And so it's sexuality with the incarnate Shekhinah, with the incarnate divine feminine, confirms and actualizes the messianic consciousness.
Yeah. I wonder, and it's something I've been wanting to research, but esotericists love to make connections. They're not always helpful or accurate.
More charts.
Yes, more charts. Yeah. But at the end of the 19th century, a large variety of esotericists, including Gnostics. So the Gnostic Church is established in 1890, comes out of the French occult revival. We're expecting an incarnated female Messiah. To sort of herald in the 20th century. And, we're talking almost 100 years earlier with Eve Frank. But, I wonder if if she was an influence on this thought, because the Frankists are mixing with this earlier material, these earlier groups, this earlier stream that becomes such a big influence at the end of the 1800s. So just a connection, something I've been thinking about, something I want to research to see if it's more solid. But yeah,
it's fascinating to think about that. So where there is a more mainstream Kabbalistic thread here with the female Messiah is that the Messiah would in the system of the Sfirot, the Messiah is the Shekhinah, is the manifestation, the divine presence. So for Sabbataï Tsevi, who was male, he actually has a very complicated gender identity. And I don't want to get like too projecting back concepts of gender from our century to theirs, but it is the case, like he was seen as having a female soul, essentially, or maybe being not quite a biological woman anatomically in the body of a man, but having feminine attributes. There are also a number of erotic and homoerotic hymns that are sung by male disciples about the beauty of Sabbataï Tsevi. And that's seen as not quite homoerotic because it's the beauty of the Shekhinah incarnate in Sabbataï Tsevi. Of course, for me, I mean, I do a lot of it. Like I said, I do some queer theological work. Of course, that's homoerotic. That's completely fascinating that there's this complicated bi-gendered figure. Again, not using trans language from our century, but that there is this complicatedly gendered figure who is the Messiah. And part of that is because the Messiah is the Shekhinah, is Malchut, the divine, the kingship, queenship of the divine on earth. I was unaware of that until this conversation, that there's a notion of a female Messiah ushering in the 20th century. That to me is totally fascinating and definitely worthy of study. There's actually a really good brand new article co-authored by Boaz Hus, and I'm forgetting my colleague who co-authored it with him, called A Prolegomenon to the Study of Jewish Esotericism, which I would put that right on the top of your list. Maybe have Boaz and my friend on the show too. You know, there's now a group of scholars who are, you know, earlier on, and this goes in Sholem as well, like, you know, Eliphas Levi and all of these guys from the 19th century, quasi-Jewish figures, were really marginalized in scholarship. It's like, well, this is nonsense. They're just like, this isn't real Kabbalah. They're taking some from here and taking some from there. And, you know, that really just reflects the bias of scholars more than anything else as to, you know, what religions are deemed, or what production of esoteric thought is deemed worthy of study. It is now understood as being worthy of study, and this could be somebody's great dissertation, you know, uncovering what are the sources of the female Messiah, since whether it's from Frank specifically or from Sabbatianism or from Kabbalah more broadly, that is a fascinating doctrinal migration.
Yeah. Well, I'll definitely want to do that show once you remember the other person's name. But
I'll
we'll
send
be
it
in
to
touch,
you, absolutely.
and I'll definitely look for that article too. But I guess unfortunately, you know, we do have to start wrapping up. So a question that I think is a great place to end is: does he matter for the 21st century?
Yeah, so I it's an interesting question. I think my answer to you would be different from my answer to most people. You know, I think for folks who are deriving spiritual or intellectual sustenance from these streams, I think he is a fascinating figure. And some of what we've talked about, you know, whether he is personally, you know, of spiritual value, you know, I think is a question. I do think, you know, I'm itching for someone, you know, with more esoteric knowledge. I mean, I did a deep dive, you know, to do the dissertation on which the book was based, but, you know, it's still, compared to, you know, a Walter Hanegraaff or people like that who really, you know, really know this stuff, you know, to uncover some of those themes in the Frankist tales, I think is would be fascinating. And, you know, every so, you know, all these tales, like I said earlier, so you know, you have the translation, you read them, and you're kind of like, where you know, it's stuff that we just don't see anywhere else. Sidebar, by the way, the one place that we do see it is a Hasidic master named Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who's widely renowned for his tales, one of which he appears to have plagiarized from Jacob Frank, and made some differences as well. The tale of sort of the rooster prince, and it's a figure who goes mad and thinks he's a rooster, and the sage is able to cure him. And that's the very short version. So there are those points of direct influence. So I think for folks, esoterically minded and Gnostically minded folks, I think this is a fascinating intersection to study, and possibly enriching as well. You know, for folks, you know, I talk about this a lot in Jewish studies. You know, in a certain way, Frank was a dead end, and Gershom Scholem saw him as like the dead end of the Sabbatian movement. True and not true. You know, there's a way in which Frank does prefigure a lot of contemporary spiritual concerns, right? So what did Frank say? Like, you can do away with a lot of Jewish law, and maybe you should, because it's holding you back from your potential. But there is a spirituality that's available to you that's grounded in those symbols and myths and traditions. I mean, that's what like 90% of practicing Jews think today, right? Any non-Orthodox Jew has that view, right? That the law and the Torah may not be what traditional Jews say it is, but that there is, you know, that there's treasure in that shipwreck. and that there's something of value that's still there. So the notion that sexual liberation is not a bad thing, but is a good thing. Obviously, that's something that's shared by lots of people. Even though, again, as I've said before, we certainly wouldn't want Frank's coercive behavior imported into anything in a contemporary way. So, I think for me, I didn't set out to reclaim Jacob Frank, and I've said many times that he's canceled. there's no rescue. There's no attempt to rescue him, and yet there's something incredibly fascinating and perhaps inspiring of the limitless bounds of his theological creativity. That for me, that is inspiring. That in this period in the 1750s, there was someone who saw things that other people wouldn't see for another 100 or 150 years, and created, for all of his irredeemable faults, created a worldview that still surprises me. I mean, I feel like I could open up the text now and find something that I'd read once but forgot about, and still surprises me every day that I turn to it.
Absolutely. The name of the book is The Heresy of Jacob Frank, From Jewish Messianism to Esoteric Myth, and jmichaelson.net. Jay Michaelson, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely, a real pleasure.